everybody, Ram Dean and Black with you. We're discussing some of the big topics in mixed martial arts. And I think right now, nothing is bigger than the fact that Mark Hunt is so angry. He is pissed off with the Ultimate Fighting Championship because of the way they've handled this Brock Lesnar scenario. 2 failed tests. Of course, we still have to figure out what's going on, and we'll know that over the coming months. But Mark Hunt believes that he said the UFC knew that this guy was taking performance-enhancing drugs before his bout, and that there was that he was exempt from being tested 4 months before he signed the contract. He says there should be a union. Does Mark Hunt have a right to be this ticked off?
I mean, he got beat up pretty badly by an enormous man that it turned out was on performance-enhancing drugs. I don't think I'd feel great about that. I think I'd be pretty irritated. But the way that he's responding, there's one of two things. One, he's really, truly emotionally pissed off. And if that's the case, you can certainly understand it. Look what this enormous beast did to him. And he beat on him and he pounded on him. And this man, Mark Hunt, has been around forever. Yeah. He felt the strength of this guy, and then turned out, yeah, he was right, he was on the drugs, right? So, but my question is he really emotionally wound up? Very well might be, and he would understand it. Or is he looking to get released? Is he understanding that now the way to do it, even the way to cut through all the noise in the world, controversy, swear a lot, really create a ton of debate and a ton of argument, and that'll get you released, because he might be motivated to do that. I don't know whether he's really, truly angry and upset, or angry and upset and looking to get released.
But can't you take the route that Chris Lieben took, go to the UFC and say, look, at this, whatever management executives, we use Dana White as an example, call up Dana and say, Dana, look, you know what? I just don't like the way the landscape is. Whatever that conversation is, can you please release me from my contract? Because I don't want to have to badmouth the company, and that's what I'm going to do if I have to continue to fight under these conditions. Because you and I were looking at it, and of Mark Hunt's last 8 or 9 opponents, a boatload of them have been popped at some point throughout their career. 3 in a row, not to mention all the other fighters on that record that have tested positive for something. And people will say, wow, this isn't tiddlywinks. You know what you're getting yourself into when you step inside of the cage and you look across and you see a decorated kickboxer or a decorated Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu champion or an NCAA wrestling genetic freak like Brock Lesnar. This is combat sports. And I think Mark Hunt, the reason why he's so ticked off is he said, I thought the sport was supposed to be cleaned up. And now this whole the way the UFC handled this Brock Lesnar situation, I could go in there and I could die and my kids will be left without a father.
Yeah, I mean, he fought in pride, right?
Yes, he did.
He knew what was going on there. But you're right, it is a different time. There's 2 elements. One is he got an exemption before. You cannot travel back in time. USADA is an independent thing. And the reason they allow these possibilities of exemptions is if you say, well, I decide today that I'm going to fight, they're like, well, we can't travel back in time and implement testing from before you sign this contract. And before you sign this contract, we have no right to test you. So it's not like the UFC granted him some kind of thing. USADA's like, we don't have the ability to time travel, therefore from today we'll start testing you. So that part people need to understand. Because at first, a lot of misinformation in the world. I was getting tweets and messages, people like, why aren't they testing Brock Lesnar? They tested Brock Lesnar a lot. Otherwise, they wouldn't have caught him.
I guess the argument would be, it's like, okay, we're going to compete at this date. It's like, okay, well, we have to start testing you as of right now.
That's what they did.
But what I'm saying is, it should have been 4 months later then. You know what I mean?
They should have said you can't fight for 4 months.
You can't fight for 4 months, and that's the issue. It's like, you want to compete today? I'm back in? Great, we're going to start testing you at this point, which means you will not be able to compete for 4 months. It just seems
fair.
And I know there are a lot of athletes out there believe that, well, there's just different rules for different individuals. And I know this Brock Lesnar thing leaves a bad taste in people's mouth that he was allowed this exemption, but the guy was tested a boatload of times leading up to UFC 200. And people then would say, well, if he was tested a whole bunch of times, how are they only finding the test after the pay-per-view happened.
Which is why your point about them maybe saying you can't fight for 4 months is valid, because the reason they didn't find out is it takes that long to run the test, recheck it, get your lawyers to make sure everything's going to be above board so you don't start accusing people until you have the proof. They now have the proof. It's an interesting one. The one issue about it being a conspiracy that really kind of where it falls apart is they pulled John Jones. They pulled John Jones.
But don't you have to make an example? It's like, yes, you pulled John.
Yeah, but he's your headliner.
But who's the bigger star?
You didn't have Lesnar yet.
Right.
He's your headliner, and you didn't have Lesnar yet. This man was ready to headline UFC 200 in the biggest rematch going against a guy who now has the belt. They're both wearing belts. They hate each other. We got footage of them fighting on a stage. We got all the stuff we want to sell a pay-per-view, and we'll pull him for failing the drug test. That's where the whole conspiracy thing kind of falls apart. You're going to pull one guy because you found out he's on the, plus USADA runs it. So it's one of those things, man. I feel for Mark Hunt more, and we looked back through it. Never mind the last 3. Frank Mir, who he beat, Bigfoot, who he beat, and Lesnar, who beat him. And he didn't freak out as much about the other 2, but he didn't take that beating, and that makes sense to me, man. You take that kind of abuse like that, you're going to feel different about it than it's like, well, I knocked out Frank Mir, turned out he was on the drugs and I still knocked him out. You're a human being. You're going to feel a lot. I beat him anyways. Look how well I did. But when you take that kind of abuse and then it turns out that guy had help in giving you that abuse, but we looked back over the years and there were a whole bunch of maybes on his last 15, 16, 17, his whole career. There were a lot of guys from the eras before and almost
the Pride days. We have to remember that.
Tested. In fact, in your contract it said we will not test you for any of these things. So that was a whole different era, which is why we find ourselves where we are today. When people lived in an era where your opponent was probably on lots of steroids, what would you do? You might go call a doctor and say, Doc, my opponent's on lots of steroids. What can I do? Doc will say, well, I'd give you these drugs, but you'll get tested. No, I won't. It says right here in my contract. You might do it too out of self-preservation.
And that's what Mark Hunt said. He said, you know what? If that's the landscape, let us all know. We'll all take stuff to be as superhuman as humanly possible. But one of the things that this is certainly going to spark is the conversation about fighters' unions. And is that something that's realistic? Will we see in our lifetime some sort of players' association?
Well, I don't know if anybody can tell us, if there's somebody watching this who can give us an example in the last decade of any large business that's gone from having no union to being massively unionized, please let us know, because I'm not aware of anything in any kind of large corporation. Unions were something that happened in a different time. I don't know how one goes about doing it, and I don't know if there are many examples in any kind of field where in the last 10 years anyone's done that. Why? Probably because there's a lot of business in stopping unions. So I don't know, man. That's outside my pay grade.
And I remember, I had the chance to go to Las Vegas to cover Randy Couture's retirement, and that was a long time ago, and I think that was around UFC 74, maybe shortly after that. See, that's a number of events ago, and they were talking at that time when Chuck and Randy and Tito were some of the biggest stars in the world. We need to unionize. We need to unionize, and still, we're not even a step closer to seeing the fighters create some sort of union.
So what you're saying is, at around UFC 75, the conversation was identical to the conversation now. We had more hair, we were younger, but we were sitting at a desk like this having the exact same conversation. Really? Is that how government works? Is that how business works? Oh yeah, I think it is.
That is the way it works, and you know how it's going to work? It's going to work exactly the same way Saturday night. We'll be watching UFC 201, but tune into FN this Thursday at 7 p.m. as we present a 1-hour preview show leading into all the action going down in Atlanta, Georgia, headlined by Robbie Lawler defending his title against the returning Tyron Woodley.